Hello, all. Welcome to our live stream today. We've got Kat, Vice Chair, Naomi, Executive Director and Founder, and myself, Board Chair Natasha, here to talk about how to become a cult leader. And before you think we've changed direction in our mission and vision, we are doing a review on the docuseries that's popular on Netflix right now called How to Become a Cult Leader. And we're going to talk through those episodes. We're going to see how far we get. There's 6 episodes and quite a lot of content. As Kat said before we started this call, it's a helicopter view of this content. It's a new phrase that we're going to start as a...
I meant to say like bird's eye view. Like it's a lot of information that we're flying over quickly. I mean, that's the whole series, right?
Yeah. It can be a little overwhelming, which might be something we talk about. So welcome, everyone. We're going to dive in and get it kicked off with opening thoughts on how to become a cult leader.
So I'm curious, you two, because Natasha, I saw some of your thoughts and people are like, how do you see her thoughts? Well, because she wrote them down. And so I saw some of her thoughts, and Kat, I saw a little bit of yours. And I'm wondering if we had different experiences in an interesting way based, Natasha, on what I saw you had written. So as someone who has spent a lot of time in a cult, and as 2 people who have not spent time in a cult, I'm really curious actually to hear what both of your thoughts were first.
You go, Natasha.
Wow. Oh man, I'm the one facilitating the conversation. This is funny.
You're on the
Actually, Kat was so thorough in her notes. I just got to say that I did not, put down anything that she had already said. And so I guess maybe that's why you're getting my perspective, which what you're probably getting is it's maybe a little negative about the series as a whole. I thought, I guess my main thoughts was that it almost seemed like simplistic in some ways. Of there was a lot of information, and also at the same time, maybe like not going too deep in any one cult. And so that was. I don't know, just wondering if the oversimplification of how someone does become a cult leader sort of separates us from the fact that is a human being who has had experiences, who has probably been formed and shaped in more ways than what was recognized. And so I think the series maybe almost presents these people as monsters in some ways, which their behavior is absolutely monstrous. But I wonder if the simplification kind of dehumanized them a little bit. So that was one of my thoughts.
Yeah, and it sounds like you're talking about the actual members, right? Like the people who joined, presented them as monsters, because definitely some of the leaders were, I would say that was fair, but
yes.
Some of the people that, I can definitely see that.
Yeah. Or not even really connecting to their stories and really the human, the emotional investment, the impact that it meant for them to experience this. That was not the focus, which wasn't the intent. I mean, it was sort of a gimmick of sort of this playbook. If you haven't seen the series, it's sort of a humorous take on it of you too can become a cult leader if you follow these 6 easy steps.
I have so many quotes. Like all I wrote were quotes.
Oh my gosh. I know
ready to follow Charlie's path to legend status.
Well, and let's talk about how Peter Dinklage in his like deep and dulcet tones is the narrator. So he's like walking you through the whole thing. And I agree, it does feel like irreverent. It does feel a little cartoonish, was something I took note of. And I do think that was an attention grabber. It felt to me like if you're looking at a magazine rack and you see a tabloid or you see something that's like meant to elicit like interest, but you're like, oh, is this the best journalism? Like, that's to be seen. But so I think that with how it was presented, and because they literally in every episode, and they're 30 minutes long, just so people can know the format. And each episode focuses on a different cult leader, like a really notorious one. And it was interesting to see the ones that they chose and how they explored overlap with different, they would bring in other examples in that episode and say, much like, Keith Raniere, or much like this cult leader. So you did see the overlap. There's a lot to digest. And I think because it was a little bit more irreverent and narrated in that way, I think it maybe was for the purpose of to grab attention, but maybe also for easier absorption of that material, just because it was such a, yeah, so much that was being explored. And I agree, though, like there was definitely one example we can get into later where they bring up sort of like some sexual abuse that happened in the cult and they completely glossed over it. Like it was almost like, ooh, cringy, because I'm like, oh, so they were coerced into staying in this cult through this like leader to continue performing sexual servitude. And it was just like mentioned and briefly discussed for like a minute. And then I don't know, like that was to me, that was like pretty serious. And I could see that that would be something that, you know, they have to kind of move on. They can't really spend too much time on that, I guess, because of the nature of it. But that was something that kind of was rough, I thought, to watch.
Yeah, I think I don't know if I walked away. I don't think I walked away with this because I'm like sitting here thinking about it now. So it wasn't just like, oh yeah, here was their goal. Like here
Mhm.
was the goal of the series. And I'm like, I guess my impression was that the goal of the series was to educate people just for the sake of, I don't know, making money. I'm like, I'm not really sure.
Mhm.
Yeah, like what was actually the goal? Like there's other ones we've watched, it's a very clear goal. They're educating on this group that, you know, there's always money involved, but they're educating on the specific group. They're wanting to bring attention to specific issues. I think the goal to me seemed more, yeah, like kind of docu-series-ish. I don't know if it was actually called a doc. I don't know if it was called a docu-series or not. I would assume not, but maybe I'm mistaken. Um, but it seemed like it was more, yeah, that helicopter view, kind of like you said, of here are commonalities that, because all the different tactics, like some of them were really essentially the same. Like there weren't really like 20 something or whatever the number was. You know, it's like, well, that's really the same one as this other one.
Yeah.
And so I think showing commonalities, I think it would have been a more beneficial series. Again, I don't think this was their goal necessarily, but I think what could have been a good goal to have and would have been really cool and really beneficial is if they really captured it at the end of here's things to be aware of so that you don't become one of these people or don't become a follower of one of these people. And so I really liked the satirical approach. I thought it was hysterical. Now, and I'm not just overall, again, I'm talking bigger picture, the tone with which they took, the comments they made. I mean, as someone who has just, again, been in a cult for a lot of my life and then you know, spends a lot of time in that area of whether it's research or hearing other people's stories and coming alongside them. The humor was definitely not lost on me as far as
Mhm.
how they were saying things. And I appreciated that, but I would not recommend it to someone who has not been out for a while because I
Mhm.
think, again, that irreverence is going to actually be painful. Whereas as someone who's been so far removed, not desensitized removed, but removed where there's things kind of like the, oh, we'll laugh about that later. There's some stuff I can laugh about now that connect with my own story that I would not have laughed about 10 years ago. And so I would definitely want to give that caution to anybody who's going to watch it. Like it might
Mhm.
be way more upsetting with where you were at in your healing and rebuilding journey than it was for me. I did think educationally it was interesting. I thought it was of benefit. I thought, again, seeing some of the tactics, but I would have liked to have seen it really brought home at the end. Again, probably not their goal, but I think that would have really cemented the value in the series.
Mhm.
I don't know that I saw a lot of value in the series other than, okay, I kind of honestly, there were a couple of the leaders that I just didn't know much about. And so I saw value in that of, oh, that's what they did and that's how that worked. Like I've heard of this person, but I haven't really, you know, done a deep dive
Mhm.
into them. Gave me more of an overview of what the situation was. Especially one who I think it was episode 5 where he was just executed in 2018. I mean, it's only 5 years ago. So
Mhm.
I liked too that it was not only talking about people who were from way back, because that can give the impression that this doesn't really happen anymore.
Yeah.
And so I appreciated too, like with the Moonies, that they spoke to how like the Unification Church really is still ongoing. Like this is actually still happening. And now we've got these two like kind of splinters from it. And so I thought there was benefit in all of that. But Kat, like the way you were talking about sort of how they would gloss over things, same with those points. Like none of that was really like those planes weren't landed. I'm not trying to keep that analogy going, but like they didn't land it. And so I don't know if I'd be curious in the comments, anybody else who has watched this or is watching it now, if any of those points really landed for you, or if you're like, oh yeah, I can see that now because we're all talking about it, but I didn't really get that while I was watching it necessarily. Again, because there weren't these like anchor points. It was just like, yes, we're sort of on this lazy river together of information, and we're not really intellectually having anything anchored for us.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I just went on for a while, but
no, I feel like there was, well, for me, I guess what the tactics did help solidify for me, like in episode 1, where they're talking about Charlie Manson. And it was interesting because already with the work, that I do in the anti-trafficking arena of this, like, it was interesting to see like how those tactics overlapped with, like pimp culture, pimp abuse, and mind control. So I think it's good to like learn what those tactics are, because I'll do an educational presentation and I will explore those tactics with people. But I have asked myself the question of like, I mean, how important is it to really delve into those tactics? Like as much as, I mean, I think at the heart of it, there's some core overlapping things that do occur, but I don't necessarily want to spend all that time in the mind of somebody that is doing that. And and I guess like, what is the fruit of that all the time? Because I guess it's interesting to people. I guess that was kind of the maybe the reason was, because I think it's kind of the same sort of logic of why people are into true crime. It's like trying to understand the mind of people that are doing these acts. And so I think that for some reason that's really fascinating to people. And maybe that's why it's drawing people in. But yeah, I guess the argument is like, but are we almost glorifying it? Like glorifying the fact that they have this, like they've sort of practiced it, or I don't know. So like, how much time do we really want to spend in the mind of somebody that is at the heart, really utilizing other people to make themselves a god, essentially. So.
Yeah, Kat, I want to jump in and add on one thing that you said there, because it's such an important point. Yes, we like to understand anyone who has suffered. There's a lot of understanding that is needed. Like we strive to make sense of what happened to us. And so we, just as a collective community, can want to make sense of situations like these 6 individuals that were highlighted, whether we even watched it happen at the time or we're just looking back on it. It's like, how do we make sense of what that was? How did that happen? How did that come to be? And there is benefit, of course, to looking at history. Like we can learn from history. We can hopefully change some behaviors, make some different choices. Oftentimes doesn't happen, but we hope for that, right? And so, but as we're trying to make sense of things and we're trying to understand, we don't want to make sense of it and understand to the degree that we're like, oh yeah, this makes sense. I could see me doing that. Like we want it to remain somewhat removed from us, at least in a moral or an ethical way. And I think people can get wrapped up in that when it comes to like secondary trauma or vicarious traumas. Like we can say, watch something and we can imagine like, oh my gosh, what if that was my child? Or what if that was my family? And all of a sudden we're having heart palpitations. We're starting to have we're having a fight or flight reaction in our own bodies. And it's something we have to be really cautious of. Like we want to understand and we want to glean from that. And we want to have empathy and compassion for people who are harmed through it and who are, taken advantage, they were exploited. And so we want that, but not to that degree of, oh, this totally makes sense to me. And I can it can become too normal. Does that make sense? I don't know if I'm phrasing that well, but,
Well,
like, we don't wanna normalize, "Oh, yes, it can make sense, and so now it's sort of normalized that this happens," and then we can become desensitized to it.
yeah. Like, obviously it was satirical, but you're right. I think that if somebody in the wrong headspace, stumbles upon material like this, it could be harmful, right? Like, I think that it is really, it's said in the satirical way, of course, but like you said, I don't know what the end goal was, because I didn't necessarily feel like it was, so let's be sensitive to survivors, let's support survivors. Like, that didn't feel to me like the end goal of the specific series. So I think that it's because there isn't really that pointed, like, what is my response from it? It just, depending on the person receiving the information, it could be harmful for them. They could be really wanting to learn. I mean, like, again, with the Charlie Manson example, like, he learned from pimps, he learned from the experts, about how to manipulate women and use them for his own gain. He learned about from, like, Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. So it's like, yes, we can treat it like, oh, it's harmless, and but I just want to, again, like, have some caution with it, that depending on the person who's watching it, there could be some harm that does come from it too. So I mean, just because you're putting a playbook out there and it is said satirically, it's also like, yeah, but depending, like, none of us obviously, all of us obviously care about supporting victims, right? And I'm sure that people watching this would feel that way too. But it could hit somebody that is not in a good headspace. So that's just, I don't know, a possibility too.
Yeah, I thought of that too when I was watching it, Kat, like, isn't there actually it made me think of I don't remember who told me this, so it may or may not have been you, but it was about trafficking, and that there's actually sex trafficking specifically, and that there's actually a book on Amazon about, like, how to become a pimp
Oh
or
yeah,
something like that. Yeah, like, and it's for
the
real, it's
rules.
not satirical, right? It's, like, literally
Mhm.
training people.
The rules of the game. Yeah, I think it's called The Rules of the Game. There's quite a few books out there and PowerPoints and videos about pimping and pimp culture, and how you learn basically the rules of, yeah, coercion, and how you get people to work for you, trafficking them, and they'll kind of use terminology like, then you're an elevated pimp. If you're able to if you're able to use coercion and never physical abuse, you're an elevated pimp. So it's like, you have to learn how to do that and manipulate people with your words only. And so it's sort of this language around it. And they have this book called The Art of Human Chess. And again, we're not trying to, like, advertise this for people, but this is real. This is out there, and it's commonly, like, traded back and forth. And there's actually, I've heard that there's, in Wisconsin, where I live, in Milwaukee, it's known as the Harvard of Pimp School, and they have what's called, like, pimp roundtable discussions. So yeah, just, that's a whole nother topic, obviously, but it is related to this, because again, the first episode deals with Charlie Manson, who, that was a really big part of what he was essentially doing. I mean, he actually tried to be a pimp, and then he failed at that when he got out of prison. And so he ended up using those same principles, though, and using women eventually to commit murder for him, right? And they took the blame for that. And again, they show this in the series, like, artistically, again, like, literally with a cartoon. So it is interesting to see that, because it's done, like, artistically rendered in that cartoonish way, and maybe that's for people to, yeah, be able to handle it, because it's a lot. But yeah, using those same
Mhm.
principles that he was able to distill from his time in prison. And again, the Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People, which apparently is the most popular of all the, prison classes that you can take. Because if you think about it, it's like, oh yeah, I want to learn how to read people, and I want to, you could take that in a positive way or a negative way. If you were trying to get away with something, yeah, that's a great resource, I'm sure. I've never read it, but I'm sure that that's something, if you would want to get away with something, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So, I mean, great resource potentially. I haven't read it either. But yeah, people can, of course, use it how they want to use it. And I could see this 6-part series being used that way as someone who wants to. Now, and again, that's not a hit on the series, because if someone wants to do something like that, they can use anything, they can find what they're looking for. So I'm not saying that as a negative on the series, but yeah, that even the cartoonish parts that you talked about, how it was literally a cartoon, I think I found it as a useful tool. Again, coming from my lens, from my perspective, I saw it as a useful tool to kind of help visualize and piece together what they were saying that we wouldn't have footage of.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So to me, it helped it actually be more real. But I think that, of course, would be person to specific. It could become less, it could be less emotionally attached, for someone. I also appreciated that it wasn't like super graphic, really, because
Yeah.
like I know the reality of it, and it would have been a lot harder for me to watch it. I don't know if I could have watched certain episodes if it had been like, I'm thinking of 1 in 5 specifically off the top of my head. I might be missing one, but it would have been harder to actually even get through the episodes if there had been a lot of more real life examples given. Even some of the videos that they pulled just to illustrate a point, but weren't actually, even some of those were harder for me.
Mm.
And again, but it wasn't because I was like disconnected from it. I wasn't taking it seriously. I was desensitive, like none of that kind of stuff. It was just, I already know. And so like, I'm bringing that to the show already with me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I didn't require that. Now for someone else, they might not really connect with, like the two of you were saying, the people who really were harmed, the people who were coerced, exploited, killed because of the cartoonish dynamic. So I think we could get probably a variety of perspectives from people who have come from different backgrounds themselves, what they think about this. So yeah, for anyone who does watch this on the replay, or anyone who tunes in today, like please feel free. Like if you have questions, of course, you're always welcome to share those. But I'd be curious about any thoughts too for anyone who has watched it. Again, overall, I would say I appreciated the humor. I could see we are creating some sort of red flags curriculums coming up. We have 2 in the pipeline, and I could see even referencing just some of the tactics that they listed and then going into a deeper dive, through research and things on them. So I saw it as maybe being a bit of a tool for us here at BE again, to a degree. But I don't know if I guess I just don't know how useful I actually found it to be. So I'm still feel a little unclear as to the point, other than I think it at least had the potential to be absolutely brilliant marketing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Just yeah, just the way they said stuff, the satire. Again, it doesn't sound like for any of the 3 of us that the points were lost. Like we got the point. I don't know someone who has no connection to anything like this, if they would have really gotten the point or not. I'm not sure. So again, if anyone happens upon beEmboldened and watches this, I'd be really curious to see. And I might look if there's any other reviews out there to check it out. But yeah, satire, of course, has a really great way of still making a point. But I don't know if it really was true satire in that way if you weren't someone who already got it. I'm just not sure.
Yeah. Would you guys want to talk about, I don't know, some of the tactics that they mentioned, as far as sort of, because I feel like they talk about these leaders and they also talk about like the characteristics of a cult a little bit. I mean, they talk about some of those experts like that they brought in, which include, ex-cult members. So some of those different types I thought were interesting, because there's like new age cults, religious cults, or money and success. And they talk about methods of control within that too. Like one of them is really controlling, like sexuality is a theme that we do see. And that's something that I think we even saw in like Keep Sweet, Pray, Obey, and several different kinds of cults. It's because you're so focused again on it's so difficult to like control your sexuality, like because it's a natural thing, like it's a normal thing to be a sexual being. And to be completely abstinent or whatever is being called for example, is so difficult that you could spend so long focusing on that. Or another example would be your physical appearance and dressing appropriately, right, to the standard of that leader, what they're calling for. And you're so focused on that that you don't really even have time or mental capacity to question, like, why am I doing this? And like, what's the purpose really of this? Which I thought was, yeah. So I thought those were some interesting places of overlap that I noticed throughout many of these.
Yeah, absolutely. Keeping people busy, keeping them distracted, keeping them tired.
Mm-hmm.
So the Moonies episode, it was literally like, okay, we're gonna go, right? Yeah, it was that one where it was the woman who shared, like they went on that walk and they're just walking for hours and hours and hours, and they got like hardly a few hours of sleep maybe or something. And it even showed in the cartoonish way, like her eyes, like she's falling asleep. And then she's, and this is when they're presenting all the information, the divine stuff, quote unquote. And it's like, and she's like moved and everybody's crying. And I'm like, well, yeah, y'all are exhausted. So it just really did itself to emotionalism and then to making a decision. And that's something we see in Steve Hassan's story. Anyone who's familiar with his book about mind control is he was exhausted. I mean, he's sleeping a few hours a night, literally ends up in a car accident, which thankfully, ultimately he left because of that. It made him slow down. It made him pause. And then he started to, see some things he couldn't unsee afterwards through a series of events. So we see this a lot. It's so works-based, whether it's, and that was something that was interesting to me. It's works-based, whether it was works-based like unto the Lord, like we would see in pseudo-Christian environments, or works-based truly unto your leader who you see as like godlike. So which episode was that one, Kat? Do you know which one I'm talking? Was it episode 3 with Jaime? Was that him? Yeah.
They served his every need.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Episode 3 where we're going to make organic lunches and we're going to give him 2 massages a day and we're going to read to him for hours and
We
we're
walked through his schedule. Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Yes. And so that's still like this works based. We have all this stuff that we need to be doing in order to, accomplish, appease, be in the good graces, whatever that looks like. Yeah. And whenever it's some sort of leader where there's any sort of spiritual component, then there's existential connection for that. So whether it's like the good karma, bad karma thing that was used, I think in episode 5, I know we're kind of jumping around based on tactics, but yeah. So he would, was it him? Was it Choco? Yeah. Death is used to explain need for enlightenment to help karmic balance. Yeah.
Right. And the extreme example of killing someone so that karma would not be, they would not receive the bad karma of reporting what was happening to the police.
Right.
Yes. Yeah. Save the bad karma by dying, which reminds me of like blood atonement within FLDS. Like, yeah, we're going to blood atone for these sins because then you'll actually be saved. So we're kind of sparing you from an eternity of damnation, of awful, of whatever it is, in that belief system. And so this is grace that we're going to kill you.
Yeah. I feel like the shifting ideology, it was interesting because these cult leaders had a way of, they would set up these principles that they would themselves not really have to live by also. Like there was hypocrisy there a lot of times, but they would set up these principles and then something that would happen that would completely change that and like shatter that. Like, oh, I forgot what episode was it, the Applewhites? Marshall Applewhite, episode 4, and Bonnie Lou Nettle. So they had set up this, again, religion based off of the fact that we're all aliens and this group would be brought up into space in their physical bodies. There would be one day that would happen, and then they would be, again, like made perfect, like this alien race. And then one of the co-founders of this died. She died of cancer. And so they had to sort of like explain, and they had to figure out a way to kind of maintain this. I'm trying to, so they changed tactics basically. and this actually, you know, was an interesting place where some of those members like ended up leaving, but some of them, you know, wanted to just double down and prove their loyalty even more. And again, yeah, so those cult leaders are really good at saying, well, they're sort of the arbiter of truth, and so they get to kind of call the shots. So even if it was their shifting ideology, a lot of times they're still not going to lose followers over that. Like they're maintaining, because their followers want to prove their loyalty and be closer to this kind of deified figure. And one thing I was also thinking, it was just so interesting with, yeah, keep him really tired. So many of them utilize this labor, you know, and that is labor trafficking. Again, the overlap with trafficking, I was noticing that. So it's a great purpose of building your empire as that leader, and also, yeah, keeping them too tired to question you, just kind of keeping people from thinking for themselves. So yeah.
Yeah, a couple comments on that. First one, I had written down this I'm sorry, you guys, it just cracks me up. So, Bonnie Lou Nettles dies of cancer. That's not funny. I'm not laughing at that. So, she dies of cancer, which, you know, she wasn't supposed to be human. So, how did she die? And then they had said, like, move the goalpost, which is exactly what happens. And the
Right.
part that was cracking me up was I wrote this quote of, a great thing about the cult leader gig is flexibility. And so and it's true though. The reason it's so funny to me is because it's so true. That's exactly what happens. My dad died. The goalposts were moved. The group's still going on. There's a new leader, but there was a gap for a while, like quite a few years, if I'm not mistaken. But like it never really died because there was like this waiting for him to return. And then sort of, you know, that loses possibility after a while. You know, it's been like 15 years. And so at some point people are like, well, you know, maybe we misinterpreted. So then there's new revelation. And then the goalposts get moved. And so now this is what's going on. This is now what we're doing. And it just keep it going. And yes, once people are so bought in, I actually read this in a book called Mistakes Were Made, and then in parentheses, but not by me, which is a play on the ridiculousness of cognitive bias. But in that book, they had an example. I can't remember the specifics, but they had an example of a cult leader where everyone quit their jobs. I may have told this story somewhere else, but everyone quit their jobs, all of this stuff. The woman was the leader. The husband was like not in it. He had nothing to do with it. He like literally went to bed that night, and they thought like the world was ending that night. So whatever was supposed to happen, and nothing happened. Well, within hours, they had figured it out. Like because they had like basically they set a vigil, pretty much is what they called it. Instead, the earth had been spared because of them. And it's like how quickly, but they had quit their jobs, they had signed over their like, they had liquidated their assets to the point of they had nothing. It's a lot easier to move the goalpost than to say that you just really, really royally screwed up. And so that plays into it. It's like, we've come so far.
Yeah.
How do we not just figure this out and make it work now? The mental gymnastics, it's actually less mental it's less horrifying to move the goalpost because of the emotional component and the just undoing of what has been done. It would be a trauma. Like your brain would have to sort of shatter that experience because it would literally probably make your body physically collapse on the floor. I mean, that's a massive, massive decision that has been made. And so how are we now going to reconcile that so we can actually stand up and move forward? We move the goalpost. So that can be what goes on for people who are following. The leaders, of course, yeah, they got flexibility. And once you've got people that hooked in and you know psychologically what's been done to them, and that's where I really caution, like, oh, if a group doesn't really seem that bad right now, hopefully it doesn't get worse. But they have a reputation for escalating because, oh, I've gotten away with this. Now I'm gonna up it. Now I'm gonna up it. Now I'm gonna, and it continues to get worse. And then we end up with way scarier situations like Waco or like these examples in here, like Charlie Manson and stuff. And gosh, there's so much we can talk about that made me think of the separation of church and state. And how, which I'm not getting into that in a political way, but it was used in episode 5. He used it to not get investigated. and that was a really bad use of it. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have separation of church and state. Like, I think there's goodness, of course, to that. But gosh, like anyone can use anything, right? And so just how he used it to get away with killing people, it's just awful. So there's so many points in this, a lot of different things, obviously, and we're kind of jumping around, but I think that's sort of the point for everybody who's watching this or listening on the replay or right now, is just to sort of give you an overview of what you're going to get into if you choose to watch it, and maybe some things to consider if you already have, maybe some new points to think about. There was something else. What was the second part of what you had shared, Kat? I'd wanted to comment on that part too.
I think I was talking about, well, I was just referencing back to when you said the labor and the free labor that, but also the resources. Yeah, it's like liquidating your resources and funneling all that into the cult. Yeah, I mean, that's extortion of their labor and their resources. But again, and it's the dual purpose of building your empire while also keeping them tired, keeping them from asking questions. Which I thought was interesting. And also recruiting, it's kind of like, again, the pyramid scheme. It's like getting other people to do your work for you. And that's really what they do really well. It's sort of like the top, I hate to say like multi-level marketing for those of people that love that, but it's like at the top of a pyramid scheme, and you've recruited people as well that have like the personality for sales. And again, it's so similar to marketing and sales tactics. Just like reading your audience and code switching. I think they were talking about code switching at one point. It might have been with Jim Jones, and how he, episode 2, and how he would read, he knew where he like geographically was located and what he needed to say. So at a college campus, for example, he would really go into quoting Nietzsche and like Eastern philosophies, because in the 70s, that's what like college students were really interested in, like the pursuit of truth and whatever, like that hippie movement. And I think that was like such a hotbed too for a lot of cults to be formed, because people were just sort of loosely looking for that quote unquote truth, and they were sort of abandoning maybe the church of their parents, I don't know. And then he would go to a Baptist church and speak completely differently. So, knowing your audience and then recruiting people to do that work for you. Sorry, you were probably going to comment on what I was saying, and then I completely went off on another tangent.
No, you're good.
Things.
You're good. It connected to Jim Jones, so we're still at least on the same person. But yeah, even with the code changing, that absolutely happens too. William Branham is known for that, actually, with Branhamism. The message, he did a lot of that depending on who he was talking to. And sometimes people, I mean, something he did, I mean, people can even make themselves look dumber than they are. Like, it drives me nuts. That is like such a pet peeve of mine. I just had someone reach out to me and tell me about a pastor who's just like, oh yeah, I'm just this farm boy. And it's like an excuse for bad behavior and for poor theology. And it's just like, I just don't know a whole lot, but God's using me anyway. Like, it makes you even more spiritual because you're not educated. And so this whole like, I'm not educated. And so
people underestimate you.
Well, yes. And then it's like, oh, well, it must truly be God's anointing. It must really be that God has chosen me, because I don't have any training or accolades or anything of my own. I could actually, God could actually be using for this cause. And so people can use that of like, I'm even more spiritual. And it's just, and not that it couldn't be true that God is using someone who does not have formal education, does that all the time. But when someone's using that as a tool to get away with things, it's just really irritating me.
It's such play acting, like, oh, I don't know why people are drawn to me. I just have no idea. And it's just so methodical. Like I saw that with Keith Raniere when I saw this documentary about Nexium. And he seems so unassuming, like, and asks a lot of questions. And that's what they talked about too, is like really the focus is on the followers and making them feel really special and saying that you're going to offer them something that no one else can. So that they feel like, well, everyone else is really stupid. Like on the outside, those are the people that don't get it. Like, we get it in here. And also Jim Jones, can we talk about how he was trying to win people over by looking like Elvis? I feel like he was going for that. I mean, did anyone notice?
He did have a look, yeah. And with the shades and yeah.
The very dark
I
black swoop
and
for
maybe
men.
he dyed it, maybe it was natural, I don't know. So,
Okay.
something that stood out to me when you said, like, the labor trafficking, I mean, Jim Jones. This is not how I mean it, you guys. I was just gonna say Jim Jones took it too far. Now, obviously, Jim
Mm,
Jones took everything too far.
they
That is
all did. Yeah.
yes, that is horrifying. The labor portion in itself, though, like, he literally trapped people in another country
Mm.
with armed guards around, like, a I don't know if it was actually fully fenced in or not, but, like, armed guards, I think it was fully fenced in,
A
if I'm
labor
remembering
camp.
correctly. I thought I knew that
Yeah,
information
there
before. I
was security, yes, to
Yeah,
keep
and
people in.
so what? I mean, that's not what we're seeing in these other examples. Those are really through, like, the elevated pimp idea that you said, Kat, that's
Mhm.
out there, and so it'd be like the elevated would be, "Okay, you're doing it really through coercion." Now, he used the coercion, and then he basically just said, "Screw that, like, I'm done with trying to coerce, like, now y'all are just trapped in this other country where you don't even speak the native language. You've lost everything. I've taken all your devices. I've taken your passports. You're now a hostage. I mean,
Mhm.
you're now enslaved. Like, I own like, you can't leave. You don't even know." I
Yeah.
mean, that
This was
was
yeah.
oh my gosh, and so that switch in tactic, I think it really highlights what happens when someone knows that they're about to lose
Mm,
and
Mm.
how serious it can get.
mhm,
Because he could have but he knew he had lied too big, like, they're gonna show up and none of what I promised them is gonna be here. They're
mhm,
gonna wanna leave. And
Yeah.
he was already in trouble in the United States. He was already on everyone's radar. The congressman wouldn't have come out otherwise anyway, and so it's like he knew, he had to have known.
mhm,
And it was like, "Okay, I've gotta switch." Like, throw he basically and the way I saw it was like he threw out the playbook. And it was
Well
just full on at that point because and some people did still stay when the congressman left with people, of course. It's not that everybody left.
mhm.
So I'm not saying there weren't people who were still, mentally influenced to still be there, but to have them actually, yeah, have armed people around to have I mean, then we're looking at like a Colonia Dignidad situation, which
Mm.
is also horrifying. And it's not the same as what we're oftentimes seeing. I would say it's sort of I see it as in, like, this different category, but I wouldn't say that other people wouldn't get there. We've
mm,
seen people get there in different ways, like, we've seen in episode 5, like, "Okay, I'm gonna murder people. I'm gonna kill anyone who's coming up against me." And so this was, "No, like, I have this agenda, and it's going to happen even if I have to inject you
Mm.
and kill you, even if I have to." I mean, it was
Well
I can't it's just the worst of the I mean, depending on I know there's some gray area, and I don't wanna start that conversation about how things went down at Waco, like who started the fire. I've heard arguments on both sides of who started the fire. Either way, they weren't coming out, and they weren't letting the rest of the
Mhm.
kids come out. I have a hard time talking about this one without crying. That one and Jim whenever we're like I feel for adults, of course, whenever I hear that people's babies. I just
Yeah.
can't. And I'm like, it shows the commitment of the leader of I will not be taken down, even if the narrative moving forward is gonna be accurate that I was full of it and I was a horrible human.
Right.
I
Right.
am not gonna lose.
It's their yeah, it's like their ego won't allow that, and it's like, "I'm taking you down with me," and, yeah, that is interesting. It does kind of feel a little like it moves towards desperation of, like, holding on to power, and we don't it's interesting because some of the cult leaders that they explore, you do see, like, obviously with Jim Jones, that was, like, people yeah, we're starting to see and kinda smell the rottenness of it, and then there's some that, like which one was it? I think it was Reverend Sun Myung Moon. And people, I don't know, it seems like there's still like his son is sort of in power, and there's still like been this passive almost like a peaceful past, like he kind of knew how to he didn't overplay his hand is what I'm trying to say. Like he kind of maintained posing with the right politicians and influencing, like he had his own newspaper, right? So it was really subtle, and he maintained that. And now like he still has, like his family has kind of held on to power in that. So he kind of played the long game. And then I think sometimes the ego takes over for some of the leaders, and it culminates in this like really, because it's like a lot of not okay things happening, but they're sort of under the surface. And then it culminates in this big thing that's like clearly the world sees as that's not okay. But it's been a storm, you know, like it's been brewing for a long time. But not all the cult leaders had that, like, you know, example maybe of like, okay, like this was clearly wrong. Like some people I think still think that it's okay. And even like it was interesting that Charlie Manson had. I was reading a article, I think Squeaky, because they had like the Manson family. So it was like Squeaky Manson. She actually wasn't involved in the Manson murders, but she did try to kill Gerald Ford, I think the president. I'm guessing under his orders. And so he was still running it, you know, from prison. And she, like in the interview I read with her, she said, I'm still in love with Charles Manson. You know, so it's just interesting that some people were able to kind of see it and get out, and it was just so obvious. And some people, yeah, they're still in that bondage, and she still loves this guy. So that just speaks to that level again of psychological coercion that they were expert at.
Yes, and we see that in other examples too. There's two that come to mind right away. One is Warren Jeffs, of course, still, you know, having some support while he's in prison. And then the other one, I'm blanking on the gentleman's name right now. He's in the where they were referencing Heaven's Gate, so Applegate and Nettles, which was episode number.
Is this the name Applewhite or Applegate? One of those names.
Applewhite. Yeah, Applewhite and Nettles. So in episode 4, I remember hearing, because I listened to this, and Christian, I saw your recommendation as well come through for an HBO series on Heaven's Gate. I listened to the 10 episode series on podcast series that's out. I listened to that a couple of years ago, and he was highlighted in that as well. And so it was kind of neat actually to see his face then, because he was in this episode. Again, I'm blanking on his name, but he still believes.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, he still does. He still believes that they are on their, you know, spaceship UFO situation, and he feels like he missed out because he had left before the mass suicide. He left, and he regrets that. He feels like he missed it. And they've gone on without him. And so, yeah, people can hold on to it. And there can be a lot of different factors for that. I think, of course, there can be that undue influence and that just cognitive bias and just locking in, and just that inability to, but I say this with all due respect to anybody who's in this position. You know, I don't know people directly. I've never had conversations with these people, but I do have to consider if there's some sort of mental illness, mental health aspect going on as well, that potentially is undiagnosed and or being untreated. That is also helping to keep them locked in for so long. We could be talking decades after at times for people to still be holding on. And I'm like, what's going on there? There's definitely some things that are unresolved, but there could be other factors too. And so again, I wouldn't want to make that assumption about what's going on with anyone, but it's something that I'd have to consider as potentially being at play.
Well, and speaking to these leaders as well, they really know their target. They know their target demographic. I think there's a quote in the first episode that Charles Manson said he looked for bruised but not broken. So people that, and that's again, sorry to bring it back to trafficking, but that's just, you look for a vulnerability, you look for your way in. And I think a lot of people that are drawn into a cult, they're looking for certainty. They're looking for someone to give them answers. They maybe have that trauma in the background. And so they, you know, that uncertainty and inconsistency, of course, they're going to look for something that feels like they can put their faith in that, and it's very concrete. But you're going to probably have some things that you maybe haven't healed from. You know, that's something that a cult leader is going to pick out, I think, and utilize. Especially, you know, I think that that's gonna, like, they're looking for people that are gonna be loyal to them, and they're looking for somebody that they can make those promises to, that is gonna be a really loyal servant to them.
Yeah, well, Kat, I just, as we've all been talking about this, we started off with kind of saying, what is the purpose? What is the goal of this docuseries? And maybe this is conjecture, but just thinking about people who are watching this might easily conclude, especially if they don't have a connection to a cult, how I would never join this. Like, there's no
Mhm.
way that I will get wrapped up in something so crazy, especially with how quickly they go through the journey of even over decades of how this escalates. Like you mentioned, Naomi, it seems so ridiculous and crazy. It seems hard to grasp that, me or anyone I know would be wrapped up in this. But Kat, what you're talking about, these cult leaders, people, they know their demographic. And I think one of the most chilling things that they said at the very end, was maybe the point is that if you think you wouldn't get wrapped up in this, you're exactly the type of person that they're looking for. And I wonder if that is the
Mhm.
goal of this, is that to help people realize these are
Hmm.
the tactics that are used. Watch out for them because you are vulnerable.
Mhm.
Mm.
So true, so true. Like, that's something I highlight too when I give a presentation is I talk about really obvious vulnerabilities and risk factors of trafficking, and you can classify them like societally, individually, relationally. Looking at someone who is homeless, for instance, very, very vulnerable to something like trafficking because they're just out there, they're exposed. Clearly, we know a little bit about their socioeconomic situation. Um, Somebody that has a drug addiction, you know, but those are the obvious ones. We all have them. We're human beings, and vulnerabilities are not inherently a bad thing, but just keep those in mind. Know what your vulnerabilities potentially are so that your safety planning and the people around you that you love and care about, even just having having kids, that's seen, that could be something that someone could hold over you if you were in that situation, if you were desperate, and not to sow seeds of fear and paranoia, but just to realize that we are all, like you were saying, Natasha, like we have that shared human experience, and it's not like, yeah, we should all kind of be sobering up and looking at these not as just like, oh, these foolish people that fell into it. And something I think somebody mentioned, is like, you don't join a cult, you join a belief, you join an idea. You want to become better, or whatever that is, that unmet need or desire that's in you, that might be a healthy thing, right? But it's just basically, you know, it's hijacked towards something unhealthy and somebody who's saying that they have all the answers. um so yeah, it's something that we all could fall prey to, essentially.
Well, and something else that this tied to that was actually just really struck me personally because I've said this about my own situation. I've heard many people say it about theirs that they weren't, even though they were like a pseudo Christian situation. So, talking about sort of that subgroup specifically, they weren't evangelistic. Like, they weren't really recruiting. And that was my experience growing up. Like, there were some people who would come, and every once in a while someone would go, but there wasn't really like, oh, we're actively recruiting. And that was always struck me as odd, even like as a teenager, because I'm like, well, aren't we supposed to be like going out and telling people? Like, we're not telling anyone. Like, it's just us. And
Mm.
sometimes somebody like marries someone and then they join in, or something like that, or like maybe a friend come, but it's not really growing, and it wasn't a focus. The focus wasn't missional, like get out there and make the group bigger. And so when they said this point, once you have your following, get away from criticism. And I
Hmm.
was like, oh my gosh,
Hmm.
that's what happened. Because when I think about my dad, he was initially, as anyone would have to do, he was going and he was trying to speak at different churches, try to recruit, things like that. And he was getting kicked out of them. Like, it was not going well. He wasn't getting treated well. And like they weren't handling it well. So, I mean, that was messy on both sides. He ultimately, creates this core group. And then that was largely it. It's not like he wouldn't talk to someone new if they were interested. It wasn't like that, but it was very like, now we hide. Now we hide in mainstream society. Like, I'm in public school, but I'm hiding it. And like, we're not trying to recruit and bring people in. And like, it was sort of this off the grid idea, more figuratively than literally. There was talk about it being more literal at points. Like my dad kind of had this dream of like us all having one giant house, like all of his wives and kids, which we all said it sounded like a nightmare. Even at the time, we're all like, no, let's not do that. But yeah, so this idea of like, okay, now we've got our people. So, and that is going to depend on the person, what's going to satiate them for number of followers. If this is the case, because again, when it clicked for him, like, oh my gosh, I think that's why we weren't evangelistic. My dad would have had what he needed. Like he wasn't into a lot of money. He wasn't a big spender. Like he just needed to kind of be fine, like it wasn't really about the wealth. There was definitely power and there was definitely sex, of course, for my dad's motivators. And so he had that, he kind of was met, like his needs were met and he was fine. He was kind of cruising in a way in that regard. And so some groups like Myung Moon, it's like, we're going to take over the world. I mean, we're freaking starting newspapers, the Washington Post here in the United States. Like, it's just, there's a lot, like they've got their fingers in everything. And then we've got these other smaller ones again, who are like, oh no, like I'm off here, I've got my handful or whatever it is, and we're good, and we're just going to kind of disappear. Heaven's Gate ended up being more that way, where it's like, okay, now we've got our core group and like we're good. And I think when someone is on the outside looking in at a group that is not in an evangelistic phase, not in a recruitment phase, it's going to look way crazier as to how those other people became involved because they're not in that phase anymore. And so you're not seeing that happen. You're seeing the maintenance phase. And that's not the same. The coercion isn't like, people aren't working as hard. They're not doing, like, again, episode 1 with Charlie Manson. They're not going through all that figuring it out to get their people and really like feet on the boots on the ground, like, like they've got their people and now they're maintaining. It's a whole different part of the playbook, quote unquote, based on this documentary. And I'm like, I think I lived that. Like, I can see that. And so again, anyone on the outside looking in at a maintenance phase, at a stay away from criticism off the grid phase, they're way like, of course it's going to look way nuttier and way like, how did these people get involved? But I'm like, well, that's not a fair comparison though, because you didn't see that group during their recruitment phase. And I think that also can be where some people stand back and they're like, well, it couldn't happen to me. It's possible that it could if you come upon a group when they are in that initial phase, or that's a lifelong plan that they have, like Myung Moon, where it's like, no, this is continuing to be something that we're invested in. That's not the case for all the groups. Some of them do, they get their people and then they want to maintain and they want to live out their lives. They've checked their goals off and now they're just gonna finish it off that way. So yeah, it depends on the goal of the leader, and kind of, the theology of it as well. But something that always struck me about pseudo-Christian groups is I'm like, why aren't they evangelistic? Now, I'm glad they're not. I'm not trying to encourage them to be, because we don't want more people getting sucked in. But I'm like, but it's so anti the gospel message, like so obviously anti the gospel. I'm like, this doesn't make sense to me. I'm like, this makes sense. They've done what they came to do. They have their needs met. They've achieved the goals that they have. Now they're maintaining. And again, that's going to look way different than when they were recruiting.
Yeah. I don't know how much time do we have? Are we wrapping up or?
We are wrapping up, Kat. So final thoughts.
Talking about this because yeah, I just thought it was interesting because I guess one thought that I had was a feeling of, well, shoot, because I think that people could look at, because there are so many, I don't want to say similarities, but just like being like involved as a Christian with like wanting to serve God, wanting to quote unquote recruit, wanting to be evangelistic and spreading the message of hope, right? Like, you know what I mean? I can see how somebody that would be cult affected coming out of that would be like, this is just another cult. And so I think that just to say that to anyone watching, that it's not even, I think that these cults are actually mirroring the original like Christianity. Like, I think that that's actually the one that they're sort of trying, like there's in a deceitful way that's focusing on a leader rather than God. So they're trying to become God. And because I feel like the methods of recruitment and things like that, we sometimes use similar language. It's a different word, you know, like in church or whatever. And I think that that's really sad because it's really confusing to people, and they could mistake it for, you know, oh, this is just Christianity is another cult, right? I don't know if you guys have thoughts about that as we close, but.
Well, I was actually I was thinking about a message that came through. So sorry, Natasha, I'll let you jump in and then I can come back to it.
Yeah, I mean, Kat, what you just mentioned, I'll just say, like, that could be a whole topic for sure. I mean, the impact that being part of a cult has on how they see the rest of the world, and like where cults get their ideas from. And as we opened up, kind of talking about things like Dale Carnegie's book that are intended for good and in positive means, are tools that can be used for evil. And the greater the good, the greater the capacity for good, the greater capacity for evil. And so that can be a really messy thing to untangle when you have experienced cult abuse. So I just want to say that this is not a small topic that we can just cover in a couple minutes. And that if you have questions about that, or you feel like that wasn't addressed well or anything, we recognize it's a much bigger conversation and is very personalized. So that's all that I want to say on that. And of course, feel free to comment or let us know if you want to have more of that conversation. So we can close that. But Naomi, would love to hear what you were pondering and any final words as we wrap up here.
Yeah, I was thinking about, so Callie, thanks so much. I saw your message about not understanding the satire or getting the humor. And yeah, I want to say that again as a reminder or a caution for anyone who hasn't watched this yet. Callie, obviously you have. And again, thank you for your vulnerability and sharing that was not maybe the best approach. And not to put words in your mouth, but that's what I'm gathering from, is it wasn't the best approach. It wasn't the best tone for them to take for you. And I think that's going to apply to a lot of people. So yeah, people who have experienced it firsthand, they're not going to find this funny. It's too real. And my hope is for that those who haven't, it doesn't encourage them to make light of it, that they're actually able to connect with the reality in a way that maybe otherwise they wouldn't have even watched. You know, like maybe it opens it up to a new audience to pay attention to it. I'm concerned that won't happen. I'm concerned it's going to just make it kind of light and maybe just comical. As someone personally who really loves satire, like I did that video with Melissa Doherty like a year and a half ago. I'm kind of want to do another one. I have a couple other ones in my head right now. I really enjoy both. I connect with satire that has very real deep roots. Because while I can laugh at the way in which it's said, it is not lost on my heart the seriousness of the point that was made. And that's why even with that video with Melissa, I recorded that serious ending that we tacked on, because I wanted to make sure that that wasn't missed on people, that people didn't watch it and just think it was funny and, oh, we're just making fun of it. No, this is real. And here's why it matters. And that was what I think, what I was saying in the beginning. I'm like, I missed that at the end of this series. I wish there had been this serious anchor point of, this is real though, guys. Like, remember, the stories we've told really happened. Real lives have been lost. And this stuff is still going on. Not necessarily all by these specific people, but who knows who's spun off and splintered off. And some of them are still going on. We know that for a fact. And so let's take this seriously. We presented it in this way so that it will have impact. But we want the impact to be that you walk away feeling more connected to the topic, not less connected to the topic. This is not a lighthearted topic. And so, yeah, I think without that, like them really closing it out well, my concern is that it might just be offensive. It might just be hurtful. It could be highly triggering for people. Absolutely. And that's unfortunate. And again, I don't know what their goal was. So we'll see how it lands. I mean, it hasn't been out that long yet. I think it's only a month or two. I mean, it hasn't been super long. So, but I did see at one point it was within like the top 10.
Yeah, I think it was
on
trending for a
Netflix.
while.
Yeah, so it definitely got a lot of attention. But for anyone else, like anyone who just follows along with us, follows along with this topic, maybe it directly connects with your life, maybe it's something you care about. Feel free to always, of course, post comments later. We do look at those on a weekly basis. So once a week, we take a look and we follow up with people to the best of our ability. And we want to see this content really equip people. We want people to know that they're seen, they're heard, they're valued, and we care a lot about prevention. I'm hoping something like this maybe will help with prevention. I don't think it's for the person who's trying to heal.
Very good distinction. Thank you all for being here today, especially with this being new on Netflix and being in the top 10. It is really important to talk about, which is what these live streams are for, is we want to be talking about what's out there that other people are finding relevant, or hurtful, harmful, helpful. So thank you for joining us today for our live stream on how to become a cult leader. Check it out if it sounds like it might be helpful for you. And we really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. Thank you all.